She was never supposed to be there. Not in that draw, not on that court, not anywhere near the biggest headlines of the tournament. And yet somehow, by the time the week was over, nobody in Stuttgart was talking about anyone else. If you had told the organizers on day one that a teenager from the Philippines, a late replacement who only got in because someone else pulled out, would end up being the single biggest story of the entire event, they would have laughed. But that is exactly what happened. And once you understand how it happened, you will understand why people cannot stop talking about her. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is almost unbelievable on its own. She wasn't even in the original lineup. Somewhere up the ladder, another player withdrew, and that withdrawal quietly opened a door. She walked through it as an alternate, the kind of entry that usually gets one forgettable line in a tournament bulletin and nothing more. Nobody circles that name on their bracket sheet. Nobody plans their week around a replacement player. In most cases, that is the entire story right there, a name that slips in and slips out without anyone noticing. But this time was different. Within days, this quiet, almost accidental entry turned into one of the most talked about storylines in the entire sport. And the strange part is, almost nobody saw it coming. Not the fans, not the commentators, not even the tournament staff who plan every single detail months in advance. It started small, the way these things always do. A handful of fans lingering near the practice courts. A slightly bigger crowd than usual at a warm-up session that would normally draw nobody at all. That is usually where these stories end too, a little extra attention that fades by the next morning. Except this one kept growing and growing, until it stopped looking like simple curiosity and started looking like something closer to devotion. People began rearranging their entire schedules around her practice times. They were showing up hours before the gates even opened, just to grab a spot along the fence where they could watch her hit a few balls. Think about that for a second. Not to watch her play a match. Not to watch her compete for a title. Just to watch her practice. That is not something that happens to just any player. That is something reserved for a very specific kind of moment, the kind that only comes around once in a long while. Then social media caught the whispers, and the story exploded outward in a way that tournament organizers were completely unprepared for. Long lines formed out of nowhere. Walkways that should have been half empty were suddenly packed shoulder to shoulder. There was talk of sold-out sessions for matches that would normally be treated as a formality, the kind of matches played on outer courts with a scattering of spectators and not much else. Suddenly, a first-round match felt like it carried the weight of a semi-final. And nobody could quite explain why, except that everybody wanted to be there when it happened. Security teams found themselves managing crowd sizes they had never planned for. Staff who usually save their full attention for the final weekend of a tournament were suddenly dealing with logistics problems on day one. And here's the part that makes this whole thing genuinely strange. This surge of attention wasn't being driven by some deep title run. It wasn't being driven by a shock upset over a legend. Not yet anyway. It was being driven by pure anticipation. People simply wanted to see her play, to be near it, to be able to say later that they were there when it all started. Even veteran commentators, the kind of voices who have covered every major star for years and have seen it all, started admitting they had never quite seen this level of energy attach itself to a player this early in her career. One broadcaster, only half joking, said she didn't even need to win that day because the crowd had already made up their minds about her. Another one, trying to play devil's advocate, argued that her next opponent simply had too much firepower, too much experience, for someone still finding her footing on this stage. But even as he said it, you could hear the hesitation creeping into his own voice, like he wasn't fully convinced by his own argument. So what was actually pulling people in? Because this clearly wasn't just hype for the sake of hype. People do not rearrange their schedules and stand in packed walkways for empty noise. Something real was happening. And when analysts sat down to actually study her game, they kept circling back to the same details over and over again. For one, she's left-handed. That might sound like a small detail, but in tennis, it is anything but small. There is something about facing a lefty that scrambles the rhythm of even seasoned opponents. The angles feel unfamiliar. The shots arrive from a different plane than what most players are used to defending. It throws off timing in ways that are hard to explain unless you have actually stood across the net from one. Her forehand draws plenty of praise, and rightly so. But the coaches and pundits who watched her closely kept pointing to something else entirely: her backhand. They called it the more dangerous weapon, an aggressive, heavy shot that she uses to push opponents backward, off the baseline, out of their comfort zone. Combine that with her willingness to take the ball early, to dictate points instead of waiting around for opportunities to come to her, and you start to understand why players across the tour were suddenly talking about her as a genuine threat instead of just a curiosity. Because here's the truth about talent. Talent alone draws a passing glance. People notice it, they nod, they move on. What actually locks people in, what makes them stop and stare, is watching that talent collide with real pressure and refuse to crack. And that is exactly what started happening, match after match after match. Every win added another layer to the story. Milestones that had gone untouched for years in Philippine tennis history began falling one after another. She wasn't just winning matches. She was rewriting what had been considered possible for a player from her country on a stage this big. And every single time she broke through another barrier, the celebrations that followed felt bigger than the score line alone could ever explain. In one post-match interview, still catching her breath, still processing what had just happened, she admitted she felt overwhelmed. She said she was thinking about her parents watching from home, wishing she could call them right away, but having to wait until the cameras finally stopped rolling. It's a small, raw, completely unscripted moment. And moments like that do more for a fan connection than any highlight reel ever could. People did not just want to watch her win. They wanted to feel like they knew her, like they were somehow part of the story right alongside her. And that emotional pull didn't stay confined to the arena. It spilled out into the world around her, into stories that made people smile without even meaning to. Her own mother, apparently, got so caught up in the excitement surrounding another rising star's storyline that she casually mentioned wanting to go watch that other player on a certain day, completely forgetting in the moment that her own daughter had a match scheduled at the exact same time. When someone gently reminded her that her daughter was actually the one playing that day, she just laughed it off and insisted. Of course, she meant she was going to watch both. It's such a small, human, almost silly detail. But it says something important about how grounded this entire whirlwind still felt to the people closest to her, even while the rest of the world was treating her like the story of the tournament. And then there was the crowd itself, because this is where things stopped being just about tennis and started becoming something bigger. Wherever she played, entire sections of the stadium seemed to transform. Flags waving, chants echoing, an intensity that made a neutral court feel like home turf thousands of miles away from home. Opponents noticed it immediately. Commentators pointed it out constantly, again and again. What should have been a routine, emotionally neutral tennis match instead carried the atmosphere of a player performing in front of her own hometown crowd. For a country that had waited decades for a moment like this, that emotional investment ran far deeper than sport ever could on its own. She had become a symbol of representation, of possibility, proof that a pathway existed where for a long time there hadn't seemed to be one at all. People who had never followed professional tennis in their entire lives suddenly found themselves checking scores obsessively, staying up late just to watch matches live, texting friends and family real-time updates like it was breaking news. Entire communities rallied behind her, not because some marketing campaign told them to, but because her story genuinely resonated with something deeply personal inside them. And once that kind of grassroots passion reaches a certain scale, it inevitably starts raising bigger questions about the sport itself. Could the pull of one player's fanbase start to influence how tournaments are scheduled in the future? Could raw audience demand eventually carry as much weight as rankings when deciding which matches get the biggest courts and the best time slots? Online, speculation started swirling, with some fans convinced that certain events were quietly adjusting based on attendance patterns tied specifically to her matches. To be fair, none of that has ever been officially confirmed, and it's important not to treat rumor as fact. But even setting the speculation aside completely, the conversation itself reveals something meaningful about where this sport might be heading. Tennis, like every major sport in the world right now, is being reshaped by social media, by global fan communities that can rally around a single player almost overnight, regardless of geography, regardless of borders. And her rise appears to sit right in the middle of that shift, whether she ever intended it to or not. There is something almost poetic about the fact that a player who entered the tournament as a late replacement, a name buried in the fine print of the draw, ended up becoming the center of a conversation about the entire future of the sport. Through all of it, through every match and every headline, she remained remarkably grounded. In her post-match interviews, she reflected on the moment she became the first woman from her country to defeat a Grand Slam champion and the first in 3.5 decades to beat a top 10 player. Let that sink in for a second. 3.5 decades. That is not a small achievement. That is history. She was asked what that moment meant, not just for her personally, but for her entire nation. And instead of delivering some rehearsed, polished answer, the kind athletes are trained to give in front of cameras, she turned the question back around, almost shyly, and said that people should really ask the country itself what it meant. She spoke about how difficult it had been growing up without anyone from her background who had walked that same path before her. No blueprint to follow, no one to point to and say, "If they can do it, so can I." And now, whether she fully embraces the label or not, she has become exactly that person for the next generation of players coming up right behind her. Even in lighter moments, away from the crushing pressure of match points and press conferences, you get little glimpses of why people are so drawn to her. When asked which player she leans on emotionally during the toughest stretches of a tournament, she lit up talking about a fellow competitor known for her humor, someone she turns to specifically because she knows she'll get a laugh exactly when she needs one most. It's a small detail, but it says a lot. It shows a young athlete who already understands that surviving the mental grind of professional sport requires balance. It requires laughter. It requires not taking every single moment so seriously that the pressure becomes suffocating. And that kind of self-awareness, that quiet maturity, seems to be a big part of why so many people, players included, have found themselves rooting for her success. So where does this story actually go from here? Because if Stuttgart proved anything, it's that we are likely still standing in the opening chapters of something much, much bigger. She has already broken barriers that had stood untouched for decades. She has already pulled an entire wave of new attention toward a sport that, in her home country, had previously existed on the margins, quietly overlooked for years. And yet, remarkably, she is still one of the youngest rising figures in the entire sport right now, which means the expectations attached to her name are only going to grow heavier from here on out. Every tournament she enters now carries a different weight than it once did. Every match arrives with just a little more anticipation than the one before it. The question of whether she belongs on the biggest stages in the sport, that debate appears to be settled already. The real question now is simply how far this can actually go. Could she eventually climb all the way to the top of the rankings? Could she inspire an entirely new wave of players from regions of the world that tennis has historically overlooked? Could her name, a few years from now, sit comfortably alongside the sport's most iconic figures, discussed in the same breath as legends? Nobody can answer that with certainty right now. And honestly, that uncertainty is part of what makes this moment so compelling to watch unfold in real time. What happened in Stuttgart wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't manufactured hype either. It was the visible result of talent, timing, and a genuine emotional connection with fans, all colliding at once, in front of an audience that simply could not look away. Whether this becomes the defining chapter of an entire era, or simply the loud, unforgettable beginning of a much longer story still being written, one thing already feels certain. She walked into that tournament as an afterthought, replacement entry buried somewhere in the fine print of the draw. And she walked out as the story everyone was talking about. If the last few weeks are any indication of what's coming next, the tennis world may have only just seen the opening pages of something that is going to be talked about for a very long time. If this story gave you chills the way it gave us chills putting it together, do us a favor and hit that like button. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think happens next for her. And if you don't want to miss the next chapter of this story, make sure you subscribe because this one is far from over.